The question that is at the base of all of our lives that must be answered by our lives is, do we trust him? Do we trust him with the world? Do we trust him with ourselves? And one of the things that the older you get, the more you care not so much about your own existence or your own creature comforts, or you see a lot of those things and it's like, those things come and go. The things you care about are your loved ones. And that's, most fathers would far rather experience pain themselves than watch their children in pain, or experience, most good parents will, what won't good parents give in exchange for their children's blessedness? And so these are the kinds of questions. And so to me, that is the question. That is always the question. Everybody has their own particular answer to it. That's always the question.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Worldviews. Today we have on Pastor Paul Vanderklay. Pastor is a YouTube commenter known for his thoughtful engagement with secular and religious ideas, along with becoming a prominent voice in the meaning crisis. Pastor Paul, thanks for coming on Worldviews.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Pastor, can we just start off with what your religious upbringing was?
Well, I was born and raised in the Christian Reformed Church in North America. They're a Dutch Calvinist denomination that was mostly founded by immigrants that came at the end of the 19th century and then after the Second World War. I'm a third-generation minister. My grandfather and father were both Christian Reformed ministers. I grew up in Peterson, New Jersey. My father had a little church, mostly African-American, in Peterson. And I spent my first 18 years there. And then I went to Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is the denominational college. And then I went to Calvin Seminary, which is also attached to it. And after there, I went to the Dominican Republic and spent 6 years as a missionary there. And after that, I came here to Sacramento, California, and have been here ever since.
Okay, cool. And how long have you been in Sacramento so far?
27 years. 28 years.
Did you start a church there, or were you handed down a church?
No, so this church was founded in 63. And so it was the first Christian Reformed church in Sacramento. And like my father's church, it was in the 60s, there were a number of congregations that were started because the Christian Reformed Church wanted to go beyond sort of ministering to the children of Dutch immigrants. And so there were churches in different parts of the country with different ethnic groups. And so this church in some ways had a similar DNA as my father's church in Peterson, except in California, the palette of racial diversity is quite a bit broader. So you've got more Hispanic, Asian, whereas in Peterson, New Jersey, it was mostly African Americans.
Okay. And was there a single event, or is it kind of gradual, what drew you to become a pastor?
I think in a lot of ways I didn't want to do this job. I went to college not knowing what I wanted to do. I did some engineering and some math, and eventually I landed on history. And then I really enjoyed theology and ministry, and so I eventually decided to go to seminary, but I planned to mostly do foreign missions. So I never really planned on pastoring a church anyway similar to my father's, but that's the way it ended up.
Yeah, and I know that one of the catalysts for your YouTube popularity was your interactions with Jordan Peterson. But before that, what convinced you to start a YouTube channel and kind of, I suppose, interact with the masses via the internet?
Oh, that's a good question. I had for a long time played around with technology. I was playing around with blogging, and I would use blogs just to have a chance to write some things. I was very active in a listserv, which is sort of a proto social media where emails get repeated. That's before there was Facebook and social media platforms, and I'd done a lot of writing on that. And I had sometimes been approached by people saying, "Well, you should write a book." And I thought, if I wrote a book, my mother would buy it, and some of the people in my church would buy it. but a lot of people don't read books. A lot of people are watching videos and watching TV. And there was a member of my church named Freddie who said, why don't Pastor Paul, why don't you and me start a TV show? And so we had the Freddie and Paul show going for a couple of years before I did anything else. And I would just play around with video a little bit. And then when I watched what was happening around Jordan Peterson going on, I thought there's something about this because I had no idea that people would sit and listen to long form YouTube. I was listening. I was a podcast listener in the early days of podcasts, but so then I made a video that basically said something like, well, three things I find interesting about Jordan Peterson. And then people watched it, and that surprised me. So then I made another video because he was doing his biblical series and doing some commenting on, I didn't have really any ground to stand on with respect to psychology, but in terms of understanding the Bible, I had spent a career interpreting the Bible and talking about it. So I thought I could make some comments on his biblical series, and that took off. And then people began wanting to talk to me about it. And so one thing led to another, and I began sharing conversations that I was having with people about how sort of the Jordan Peterson phenomenon in 2016 to 2019 was sort of changing their lives. And one thing led to another. And so around me sort of developed a community of people that were interested in talking about ideas on the internet. And that's sort of kept on going for now 7, 8 years.
And how has interactions engaging online with some of these Jordan Peterson fans either enriched or challenged your faith?
Fairly early on, people were expecting me to bring something new to the discussion. And I didn't really feel like I necessarily had anything new to bring. I wasn't going to start a new church or um, sort of bring out some new theological perspective. I I don't know that it challenged my faith. I think it probably strengthened the confidence that what I had been given was solid. I had in many ways I was formed by my father, who I had watched him do ministry, and I didn't probably appreciate all of the ways that that had formed me. And so what happened with the internet was I just sort of kept doing what I had always done before I was on YouTube. And I don't know that it's necessarily changed my faith a lot. It's certainly given me a bigger perspective on what God is doing in the world. But in terms of my faith, I don't think it's changed that much.
Mm. And as for, I guess, your theological views, have any of them significantly shifted in the last 10 years or so?
I don't think so. I really don't think so. And part of this is I came to this already in my late 50s or in my 50s. And so in many ways, I was pretty much formed. Now, if someone's coming to this in their 20s, there's probably a lot of formation that will happen, but I had been shaped by years of ministry, years of preaching, years of being in my denomination. And so I don't know that my perspectives or my theological postures have really changed very much.
Are you a free will guy or predestination?
Well, I like to talk about real agency. So I definitely am a Calvinist. And I think that we have agency, but I wouldn't say that our wills are free because I think there's probably a fairly limited menu among. I noticed when my sons started playing video games, there was one game they'd play, Uncharted, and it seems like you can run anywhere you want to in that world. But the more you run around in that little world, the more you realize that hmm, things sort of lead to um, things sort of lead to outcomes that the designers had intended. So that doesn't mean we don't have agency, but I do think that um, yeah, we are definitely formed.
That's I never thought about it from that perspective, the video game perspective of the borders in a video game. You do have like a GTA type. You do have free will in GTA technically, but there's plenty of things in GTA you just can't do because, like you said, the designers of the game don't allow you to do it. That's an interesting perspective on that. And when it comes to the modern church, because obviously you engage with people that Jordan Peterson fans. I'm sure a lot of those same people are fans of John Vervaeke, because you've also had high engagements with the whole meaning crisis going on. How do you think the modern church so far has done with handling the meaning crisis?
I When it comes to people experiencing a meaning crisis, many of the people that are comfortably and happily embedded in their Christian faith aren't really having one. That being said, I don't know if the church has done a very good job in terms of evangelism and discipleship with certain kinds of people who have been mostly formed by certain narratives in the world. And what that means is that people who are in a church, and happily so, aren't experiencing a meaning crisis. People who, for one reason or another, have left the church, deconstructed, wandered away, the meaning crisis is going to find them. And I think at that point, one of the things I learned early on too was Jordan Peterson was getting a lot of people interested in discovering more about the Bible and going to church. But most churches weren't in a position where they were terribly ready to receive someone coming in, let's say, from a Jordan Peterson event. I think the Orthodox Church, partially by virtue of Jonathan Pageau's work, has, definitely had a moment. And Jordan Peterson has given Bishop Barron, for example, quite a bit of publicity too. But I think most churches refine their capacity to minister to the people that are already there. Churches often struggle with engaging people outside their walls.
Hmm. Do you think Protestant Christianity is still intellectually compelling in a postmodern or post-secular world?
I think almost all Orthodox and Catholics are deeply Protestant, even if they don't know it. I think Protestantism has changed the landscape over the last few centuries. I tend to think that sort of if you watch The Walking Dead, at some point in the series, they figured out that, oh my goodness, everybody has this virus already. I think everybody already has a lot of Protestantism in them already. And I think as we move forward, that isn't going to change. Now, when you say Protestant, you're talking about an enormous diversity of churches
Sure.
with all kinds of different backgrounds. Right now, there seem to be two kinds of churches that are doing fairly well. One is sort of a high church, highly liturgical, highly sacramental type of church. The Orthodox and traditional Catholics and some Anglicans get a lot of attention there. But sort of in the YouTube thinky space, most people don't recognize that for in most places in North America, the kind of church that is actually doing a lot of evangelism and discipleship are usually Protestant megachurches. Those churches continue to be really vital churches in North America, even though they are quite disconnected from most of the conversations that I am having.
Mm. Do you A friend of mine shared this with me a little while back. There's some article that was claiming that the modern non-denominational church is overly feminized based on a lot of it was based on the music playing a role in your emotions, and I forgot what the other parts about it were, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that, if seeing any kind of parallels of that being true, if it's too feminine to a degree, which can also, I guess, equate to, I don't know if the stats still show that there's more women than men attending, non-denominational churches right now.
Yeah, that's a big conversation, but if there's any segment of the church that responds to religious market forces quickly, it's Protestants. If there is a new if there is a new audience, a new niche opening up somewhere in the religious marketplace, Protestants will get there usually first and fast. I think part of the success that the Orthodox and some traditional Catholics have had is they sort of found themselves in a place where people looking for a more masculine variety of church, they sort of found that. But Protestants have been looking at returning to ancient modern practices, looking at intentional liturgy. That's been a move in Protestantism back to the emerging church days for a while already. So Protestants will Protestants will usually very quickly address any gap that is in the religious marketplace in America quicker than almost any other group, because that's kind of how Protestants have adapted in this religious context.
Mm. Since you've been a Christian for, your whole life and you've seen multiple different phases of Christianity throughout that time, so to speak, are you surprised by sort of the rise and interest of apologetics?
No, I think in many ways, if you look at just YouTube, the golden age of YouTube apologetics, I think, has passed. I think Justin Brierly hit that wave about as well as it could be hit. He was doing podcasting before YouTube was, with bringing atheists and Christians together and having them have a conversation. you know, Apologetics sort of a certain well, let me say it this way. A certain kind of apologetics sort of reached a peak during the height of the new atheist movement. And I think that certain level of apologetics has sort of sunk down with it. Apologetics tends to address, sort of like Protestantism, the needs in the marketplace. And I think now most people become Christians. I'll often tell people that, people don't go out and pick a religion the way someone would pick a practical used car. Religion is much more a thing of the heart. They fall in love and their head follows. And apologetics, I think, within the faith has long been there to support Christians who have questions and doubts, rather than the image of apologetics actually convincing people. In my
Mm,
experience, people want something and then they find reasons for it, not the other way around.
mm. Because I suppose then you're surprised with the whole, I guess, how much more debating there is on those topics too. Whether it's street debating like how am I? Cliff and Stewart, like they do, or if it's Frank Turek, William and Craig. Are you surprised by that? How much more there is, sort of either either it's being one-on-one debates, or if it's literal people can come up to the microphone and then they can ask whatever question they like, and that can easily turn into a debate itself.
Yeah, I don't think there's more. I think there's actually less. I don't think it's ever going to go away completely. But when in 2018, when Jordan Peterson sat down with Sam Harris for 4 meetings, those were huge crowds. I don't know if we could necessarily fill those kinds of audiences today. And if you look at someone like Alex O'Connor, who in some ways is sort of the preeminent YouTube um, atheist. I mean, he's not even an atheist anymore. He's an agnostic.
Mhm.
And he's quite a bit better informed than he used to be. And even if you listen to him talk, very few people today are imagining that we reason first and decide second. I think, Tim Keller, who was a very effective evangelist, he said, basically what I do is I make Christianity look attractive, and then I give people reasons why it's credible to believe. But the real thing is they want it before they can explain it.
Mm, mm. Yeah, what would you say? I'm actually curious to hear your answer to this. What do you think the top 3 issues facing Christianity today are?
I think the same issues that they've always been. I think, wobbly Christians are are always a problem. Um, I think the church when the Ukraine war started, everybody imagined that this was going to be the kind of war that people had been expecting for the last 50 years. And within 2 or 3 years of the Ukraine war, now suddenly it's not determined by big weapon systems. It's determined by drones, drone swarms. The church usually builds from the last war. And the last war tended to be rationalism, modernism, and the church has I don't think the church is in that part of the advantage that the church has is that it's very old, and that in many cases, even as things change, there's a limited set of things below the surface that tend to reemerge and as different ages come. And the church tends to have those antibodies in its genetics. And I think it's for that reason that you see sort of the Orthodox moment and sacraments come up, because as the philosophical and cultural underpinnings shift, there has to be change. And so we're going to see a mass of death of churches that were built for the, let's say, post World War II period. We're going to see lots of churches die in the next 20 years. But we're also going to see new churches arise, and we're going to see new arrangements of things arise. For example, neo-evangelicalism is really a creature of what happens as the fundamentalism of the pre-Second World War was sort of losing its luster, and the main line was beginning to get creaky. And so you saw things like Billy Graham and Christianity Today, and then that sort of gave birth to the seeker movement. All of that church machinery was sort of developed very quickly and then spread around the world to address the needs of its time. We're seeing an end of that phase, and I sometimes use the word metagelical, because what we're going to see is a cluster of Christians who aren't focusing so much on, how can I beat up the Roman Catholics in terms of um, the ideas that I have, and how can Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants actually work together to bring people to Christ. And many of the people who have moved towards Christianity and the church as a result of what I've done online, many of them are in Orthodox churches or Catholic churches, or most of them are not in the Christian Reformed Church, but I count that as a win. And I think we're going to see the church continue to work together beyond some historical disagreements and discover new ways of the internet has radically changed how we find each other and communicate with each other and connect with each other. And so we don't really know how the internet is going to impact churches. Some of the easy things we've seen early, like churches having websites and then churches live streaming video. But a lot of what has happened sort of around me asks questions about what kinds of relationships can we create and what kinds of encouragements can we give over these new tools, and how will that impact sort of the body of Christ. And I think we are going to see this continue. I'd say the third challenge is going to be, once again, Islam. Islam, I think, Islam is a very interesting religion in that it's sort of a hybrid between Christianity and Judaism that developed sort of on the fringes of civilization. And it's attractive in that it offers clear guidelines. Many of the reasons people are interested in, let's say, Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Islam has some of that, because it offers people clarity in a time when people feel uncertain. And that's attractive because now suddenly I have clear answers to everything. I have a lot of cut and dried things. The difficulties are going to be, hmm, how if you think sort of a modern if you think sort of a postmodern chaotic world is addressed by having very clean boxes and tidy categories, wait until you realize that you're actually having to shift those categories to make life work. How many women really are going to want to give up their driver's licenses? How many women really are going to like the idea that their husband might say, I'm taking another wife? I just ran into a situation pastorally where a woman who had entered Islam because of her husband decided to go there, then discovered that his husband had another woman in another household. And when she confronted him on that, she said, "Oh, well, here with Islam, you can have a second wife." And it's like, what's the difference between a mistress and a second wife? If wife one number one doesn't know about wife number two, I'd call her a mistress. But then he tried to sort of marshal, the affordances of Islam to say, our religion allows me to have this other family. Wife number one isn't fully buying this, as you might imagine, because she, in fact, has been formed and raised in a Western liberal environment where, truth be told, she doesn't have to take it. She can divorce him. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how Islam plays in the West. That's obviously a bigger issue in Europe, where there's much more Muslim immigration to England and to Netherlands and Germany. In the United States, a lot of our immigration comes from Asia and Latin and South America, so tends to be Catholic or Buddhist, which Americans are sort of kind of able to deal with. But I would say, yeah, those three things are probably the biggest challenges we're facing right now.
Yeah, the Islam piece is so interesting. I think to me in the next 10 years or so, we're gonna see maybe it start to decrease or more people are gonna leave Islam because they do the whole thing now where it says, the internet is the biggest enemy of Islam now because how much more information is spread across based on people actually discussing, first of all, their experiences being Muslim that are no longer Muslim, and then two, what the Quran actually says, what the whole Islam religion actually spreads, along with the things Muhammad actually did within his lifetime. Despite the fact that I think Islam is still the fastest growing religion because of birth rate currently. I think that's true. But I think we'll slowly see more and more people leave the religion itself.
I think a lot of Islam hasn't really grappled with the softer, more attractive elements of let's say Western liberalism, and the fact that many people want to get out of Muslim nations and come to the West for a lot of the freedoms that Western nations have afforded. And you look at someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who goes from Islam, becomes a new atheist, and then recently now is, becoming a Christian. I think there's something in that story that is telling for a lot more people than just herself.
Yeah, or even another example could be, not the same exact thing, but apostate prophet who was a ex-Muslim who rose to fame on YouTube because of his ex-Muslim content has recently given his life to Christianity. I think over the last couple of months, so stories like that too, I think add credibility to the whole Islam slowly diminishing from a popularity standpoint. But yeah, those are three good points. And for you, since you operate as an in-person pastor as well as an online one, do the issues people come to you with online and in person, are they usually the same?
Well, part of the difficulty is the sample. So my congregation, the congregation that has been at this church for 28 years, most of them are older. Their issues tend to be what most pastors would know in a church like this. Online, now, because I've been doing this for enough time and I now have some people from the online world start to come into the church, now you're seeing a little bit more mixing because part of it's just age. Younger people are digital natives, to the degree that any of the older people are on the internet at all. It might be Facebook, if anything. And so they're just living in different worlds. I Yeah, they tend to be very different presenting issues, but most things that Christians struggle with can tend then, once it gets down low enough, get into much more basic questions of how well do I trust Jesus? What kind of promises do I receive from Christ? How can I live the Christian life? Challenges of living the Christian life depend a lot on how old are you? What are the challenges of your age range? And this is something that you begin to realize as you get older. I mean, when you're in your 20s, you have a lot of challenges about career and mating and, will I start a family? You get into your 30s and 40s, if you have started a family, then it's okay. How can I keep the family afloat? How can I keep my Christian faith alive? What kind of church do my children need? You get into your 50s, 60s, and 70s, then much more health issues. What about my children and grandchildren? How can I how can I not be too upset by the kinds of changes I am seeing all over society? So different. I find that in many ways, the pastoral issues are quite dependent on sort of where people are in the age cohorts.
Mm, mm. Do you at all fear that because of sort of online sermons and pastors online as well, that people are starting to treat any type of theological encounters online as it being actual church versus actually going in for church?
I think so. One of the ways you can quickly look at church history, or at least at the segments of the church, if you ask someone who's in orthodoxy and you say, what's really the essence of your church work, they'll say, well, the liturgy, the divine liturgy changes me. That's the key. If you go look at a Roman Catholic, they'll say, this is the Eucharist. If you look at Protestants, it's the preaching of the word. Now, one of the things that YouTube disrupts is in my grandfather's day, most of the people that went to the churches my grandfather served were farmers. Most of them had maybe an eighth grade education. If they received any kind of magazine at all, it would have been the denominational magazine. They read the Bible, but that was the world they lived in. And so when they came to church on Sunday, they received the catechesis and the preaching and the teaching pretty much from the church. That was their world. Come television, suddenly, well, there's TV preachers, but, you know, TV preachers tended to, Charles Stanley, my grandmother loved watching Charles Stanley. I mean, he was a very good preacher, but TV was not sort of ubiquitous enough that Charles Stanley would rival her local pastor. What we see now is that if you're into Christian content, learning about the Bible, studying apologetics, YouTube affords you 24/7 access not only to some of the best, but some of those that are best tuned to what you're particularly interested in. That begins to shift what the church brings to people. And so I can think again in this way, it's part of the reason that we see Orthodoxy and Catholicism offering what people can't get online. And in fact, I would have people say to me things like, what does it mean that I listen to a Calvinist minister, 5 days a week when you release videos, but I go to Catholic Mass on Sunday? And on Catholic Mass, there's very little of a sermon, and I don't really listen much to. I go to Catholic Mass to receive the Eucharist and to receive the liturgy, but I go to YouTube to get brain content. In some ways, this is a bigger challenge for Protestant churches because Protestant churches are sort of in that way in competition with YouTube and podcasts. But there are still many things that churches offer that you can't get online. One of those things being community. And so, part of what I have started in sort of in conjunction with what I've done online was in-person groups that I call estuary, where they're church adjacent. They're not intended to replace church or anything like that. But they're a lot of because of the space that I work in, a lot of people that I talk to, they're a little interested in Christianity, or maybe they're not interested in Christianity, but they're interested in conversations around the meaning crisis, around symbolism, around the kinds of things that are sort of downstream from Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Peugeot, but they don't have anybody to talk with about this. And it's one thing to do it sort of online like we are now, but what would be really nice is that if they had a group of local friends that they not only had these kinds of conversations that they enjoy, but they could do other things with too. And so again, you see that I think I think in many ways, what the internet is going to force churches into is going to be the communion of the saints. That this is going to be the aspect that you can't, you get some of that online with your online friends, but wouldn't it be better to actually have in real life friends? And I think this is part of the way that the internet is disrupting, but also some of the ways that churches are going to have to adjust.
Mm, mm. What would you say is the most unexpected thing you've learned so far in your online career from non-Christians?
I wasn't surprised that non-Christians have a lot of Christian code in their culture. Tom Holland sort of came along and brought that to light, but I long suspected that. I think the big thing that has surprised me most was how supportive of Christian ministries non-Christians could be, even if they didn't believe it. That surprised me. I mean, I started out doing, before we had estuary groups, I started out doing Jordan Peterson meetups here at my church. And, people who identified as atheists and they defended their atheism, they would regularly send donations to my church. And you'd think, what's with this? And it's because even if they didn't believe a lot of the religious things that I believed about Jesus, they saw that I was doing good in the world and they wanted to support it. And I sort of understood that theoretically, but I think I saw that practically, and I've seen that practically over the years now.
Are these atheists' barrier to belief in God consistently be the reason of suffering?
No, I think many of them just don't believe it. I think they've been formed by sort of a secular perspective, and they're skeptical about things that would be called supernatural. And so the idea that Jesus is the Son of God, the idea that he rose from the dead, miracles, they're skeptical about. So a lot of them are just skeptical about a lot of that. Some of them were raised in Christian or religious households and they were burned. But a good many of them are just plain skeptical. And they're just sort of like, unless I see it with my eyes and I'm convinced, I don't buy it. And even if I do see something weird, it still doesn't mean that you're right about Jesus and stuff.
What do you say to those that their belief would only come from evidence in front of their face?
Oh, I'm skeptical that that's actually the reason. I don't think we believe reason first. I think we believe heart first. I, what we believe is not subject to our will, and rightfully so. If you walk into a road and say, I don't believe in cars, I don't believe in cars, you're not really going to find that convincing because you've lived your life in cars, seeing cars. Something deep inside of you believes or doesn't believe. And you asked early on about my Calvinism. I think basically those who believe and those who don't believe, that's God's business. And God does that through everything in their world. Now, how God will deal with that long term, that's up to God. But people believe. And I know people who at one point in their lives were hardcore Pentecostals who would tell me about miracles and healings and word from the Lord, and they would speak in tongues. And I've seen them walk away from the faith and a few years later not believe any of it anymore. I've seen that. And I've seen other people go the other way. So people are mysterious in terms of what they believe and why. And I don't think other human beings have the keys to unlock other people's hearts. That's what I think the world is constantly trying to invent. We have propaganda and all sort of ways to try to influence people. And YouTube is a massive influence engine. But I believe finally, I know people who, there's a woman who told her story on my channel once where she was a 16 or a 17-year-old, and her parents found God and started going to church, and she wasn't buying any of it because she was just a rebellious teenager. And they sent her to a Christian camp, which really made her upset. And she finds herself on the ground with this spiritual presence upon her, basically saying, you know, I love you. Do you believe in me now? And I know 3 people who have had stories like that. I know another woman, she's over 100 years old now. And she told me a story where she was alone and in bed. She was raised in a Christian environment, et cetera, et cetera. But she didn't. But she had some questions about the idea of the fear of the Lord. She had an experience of, again, a similar, of God coming upon her and talking to her. And so she doesn't question the belief in God. She's got all kinds of other interesting ideas, but I find that to be normal. I've got another friend who he was dating a Christian girl, but he wasn't a Christian, had no idea. He's not an American, from a much more secular country. And God just came upon him one day. And after that, he believed. And why him and why not this other person? And I can't tell you that, and I've seen, but again, I've seen lots of other people that have a lot of weird supernatural experiences and they don't believe. So salvation is of the Lord.
Have you yourself had one? A supernatural experience?
I've seen many supernatural things. I haven't had that kind of experience, but I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic. And I mean, it's not unusual to talk to foreign missionaries, and, you see strange things. And, if you're here's the thing about, sort of the social agreement of anti-supernaturalism that is sort of losing its grip on our culture right now. If you're a pastor, people will tell you things that they won't tell anybody else in church because it sounds weird or embarrassing. But when you listen to them, it's like, these are honest people. I don't believe, just look at C.S. Lewis, what he does with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. With, the professor asks, Lucy's siblings, who are concerned because she said she went through a wardrobe into a winter land and talked to a fawn. When people come to me with their strange story, are they liars? No, I know them. They're not liars. Is their map of what happened necessarily accurate? Maybe, maybe not, because you have an experience and then very quickly what we have to do is sort of map that experience onto our larger worldview. And that's usually, people can't help but sort of frame their experience in those terms. But it's so funny when I talk to people who are skeptics and they say things like, yeah, well, miracles don't happen. To me, it's just the most absurd thing people can say, because this world is far stranger than a lot of new atheists pretended it was. If you live around this planet long enough, lots of weird things happen.
Yeah.
But can I map them? No, not necessarily. Do I feel the need to? Well, if I already this is where reason kicks in. If I already know that I probably can't, why should I worry about it? So I don't. Somebody has a weird experience. And, sometimes I say, there's one person right now who is, you know, she tells me her deceased husband regularly comes for visits. She's also got some dementia issues. It's probably dementia. But, I don't really need to map it because she's just having conversations with her late husband that she's currently finding rather annoying because, um, you know, he isn't there for all the reliable things he should be. So, but, she's having some issues with dementia right now. But other times people, they're not demented and they tell me the story and it's like, I completely believe them.
Interesting. Do you have any unpopular opinions about modern pastors?
Now, when you say unpopular, do you mean that a lot of people don't hold them, or do you mean that some people won't like that I say them? I so there
It could be both, honestly.
so there's it's a great story. I had just moved into the neighborhood. Um, I'm out in the front lawn with my son, and a guy who lives right down the street pulls up and says, "Oh, does your son want to play soccer?" I didn't ask my son. I said, "Sure." He doesn't know enough to whether or not to play soccer. He likes, he'll have fun. So he was the coach of a little kid soccer league in the area, and he lived about 6 houses down. And he and his wife eventually, became friends with us, and they joined our church. And he was one of the guys who brought a lot of people to church. It's just how he was. But I remember when, because he didn't know, he just knew that, my kid was playing in front, and then we got to know each other. And of course, guys, well, what do you do for a living? I'm a pastor. He says to me, pastors are kingdom builders. They build their own kingdoms. And it's like, I know what your church experiences have been. You know, he grew up in the black church and, he had seen all kinds of things in the churches he grew up in. And it didn't mean he wasn't a Christian, but he sure had a low view of pastors. And it's well earned. Pastors can be. So on one hand, I've known a lot of pastors who I wouldn't trust at all. On the other hand, I know a lot of pastors who get a bad label because of the charlatans out there, but I know a lot of other pastors who are, God's gift to this world because they are the genuine article. They believe what they believe. They are models of the Christian life. Pastors are a huge mixed bag, and yeah, so
You think there's like an over romanticization of pastors in the modern church today?
less than it was 50 years ago.
Less. Really?
Oh,
I
yeah.
thought it'd be I thought it'd be more because there's more mega churches now, therefore there being more pivotal figures of those mega churches being the pastors.
Well, quantity is always hard to judge with questions like this. I think, for example, my father liked cars, and so we lived outside of New York City, and so we'd go to the New York Auto Show. And my father knew that if we wore his clerical collar and we came up to the gate, that they just let us go through because they saw he was a minister. Can you imagine any place in America today if you go to a movie theater and someone says, "Oh, Reverend, come, you don't have to pay here, come right in." Can you imagine that ever happening today? So in some ways, pastors do not have the kinds of cultural privilege that they enjoyed 50 years ago. On the other hand, you're right. Um, Certain pastors have been able to create celebrity dynamics and sometimes milk it. But there's always been clergy corruption. The Protestant Reformation was about clergy corruption. Um, Power corrupts, and being a pastor can be a very dangerous vocation because pastoral ministry works on trust. Once you gain someone's trust, they are vulnerable to you. And well, then suddenly you have to deal with the temptations in your heart. And that's why there will always be stories of pastors sleeping with who they shouldn't sleep with, or pastors stealing money, or pastors playing power moves in a church, because pastors work on trust. Once you build that trust, if you're not, um, if there's a weakness in your heart for something, you'll be tempted to exploit that trust. And then suddenly, and that kind of failure does tremendous damage, because all the way on down the line, it's like fear of dogs. Once bit, twice shy. The saying goes. You find someone who's afraid of dogs, and you ask them why, and they'll say, because when I was a kid, there was a dog next door. Even if the dog didn't bite him, that dog always barked at me and growled at me, and so that fear from childhood remains. And so when pastors betray their calling, it's very costly.
Mm, mm. When it comes to meaning, do you find that meaning is discovered, created, or revealed?
Well, John Vervaeke likes to talk about, he has this word transjective, which basically means that I don't make meaning in my heart. I think the world is meaningful, but meaning is the kind of thing that happens in a between space. And meaning also has a lot to do with agency and opportunity. And that's why people find work, certain kinds of work meaningful. And the reason they find some work meaningful and some work not meaningful is because meaningful work tends to work from a relationship that someone has with the world. Now, in modernity, religion was defined, there are definitions that have to do with the supernatural, or the Bible, or things like that. But I think religion is actually has to do with that which is highest, and then the path to that which is highest. And so in that way, meaning and what is truly religious are deeply connected. And often when people talk to me about their jobs, I'll often tell them, for most people, you can either make money or have meaning. Because a lot of times, if work isn't meaningful, you have to pay people to do it because they need motivation. But if work is meaningful, people will do it for nothing because it begins to align with their own religious mapping, landscape, and orientation. Because we tend to, people all over want to make the world a better place, but their definition of better has a lot to do with their worldview.
Mm, mm. What theological or philosophical topic do you currently wrestle with the most?
Well, my channel, I I I often make a video. I often make a daily video, which has come to be called Homeroom because of the time that I release it, and a lot of the people sort of in the little corner, which is kind of the online community around me, a lot of them watch it first thing in the morning. And those videos are often other videos that I've seen, things that I'm thinking about. And so I'm always thinking about something. And right now I'm thinking a lot about the fact that the world that we currently share has been deeply shaped by, let's say, the events of the Second World War. And and then the events of the counterculture. As those generations die out, culture changes. And we're seeing that right now. And so right now we're at a point where there's a lot of disorientation in people's lives. People don't know who to believe. People don't know what to believe. And a lot of again, going back to what I talked about in terms of my concerns for the church, The way churches have sort of worked is that there's a whole bunch of on-the-shelf answers. Most of the things on the shelf of the church have been developed to address the issues historically that the church has had to deal with. Once that set of self needs sort of goes away and dies away with a generation, a lot of those on the shelf things gather dust. And just as in Ukraine, all of the armies of the world are watching the war in Ukraine because they're realizing, oh my goodness, we have hundreds of billions of dollars sunk into training and equipment. And, with just, let's say, the advent of cheap mass produced drones and some AI or some fiber optics, a $1,000 drone can take out $1 million tank. That's a problem if you have thousands of $1 million tanks and someone says, I'm just going to build tens of thousands of $1,000 drones. The church is in some ways in that kind of a changing environment. But as I said before, it's fortunate for the church that actually the church is very old, because many of the issues that we deal with, although things like the internet are new today, the church has dealt with some of these issues in the past. And so usually what part of the church does, not dissimilar to, let's say, our bodies, maybe I haven't been exposed to measles for a very long time because there haven't been a lot of measles around. Now there are new strains of measles that have some genetic similarity to, measles that my ancestors developed. And so, suddenly it takes a while for the body to catch up. But that's the process that's happening now. And that's why it's a good idea that there are thousands of Christian YouTube channels and Substacks out there, because the work we're doing now is the continual process of updating. That's why the work of theology never ends, because what theology always does is take the revelation of Jesus Christ and adapts it to our current context. And the Holy Spirit is all throughout that process. And so that's what we're doing. But it's an ongoing job, and it's a messy job because often we have to get 10 things wrong before we get one thing right.
Yeah, and when you indulge in heavy topics, I mean, do you even to this day ever have doubts in God anymore?
Well, doubts are emotions. You get emotions for all kinds of things. And let me rephrase that. One aspect of doubt is feeling doubtful. So before I started YouTube, I was one of the things that I said to people often was that I found myself reading C.S. Lewis's book Miracles like 2 or 3 times a year, partly because sort of the world of scientific materialism that Lewis wrestled with was sort of weighing on me. And I could sort of feel some of the pulls of deconstruction on me. So then I read Lewis, and Lewis is a deep enough thinker that when you go back and read him, you find things you didn't see before. And so I was using Lewis in a very, Miracles is one of his most straightforward apologetics books to sort of help me think through the issues that were challenging me. And like, we just went through COVID and we all got this involuntary education on our immune system. Often you have to get a little bit sick before your body knows really how to deal with a virus. And in some ways, that's like doubt in the Christian life. Michael Poliani and his ideas, and Tim Keller picked up a lot of these ideas too in his ministry. When we frame it like doubt, we sort of see it in kind of a binary way. And what Poliani and Keller articulated was it's actually more that another competing belief is rising in your heart. And what you sort of have to do, and a lot of this is sort of pre-conscious, what you have to do is sort of wrestle with that other belief. Now, that competing belief in your in you, you probably caught from someone else. And so, if in fact you catch that competing belief and can wrestle with it and learn from it, you can much better engage that other person having wrestled with it in yourself. That's also part of the reason that old people historically have been considered to be sources of wisdom because they've seen a bunch of things. And we might not see exactly because there are sort of new things, but it's also the case that there's nothing new under the sun. Both are true. And so older people have had enough time to wrestle with things. And so then when you discover something as a young person for the first time, it's like, oh my goodness. And an older person's kind of like, yeah, that's there, but you'll probably wrestle with it for a year or two. And then you'll see that that's probably not a big deal. Although some people it does capture and sort of runs away with them. But again, people in the world are really complicated. So I struggle with things, and probably the easiest answer is if you want to know what I'm struggling and thinking about, you can watch my homeroom video because most of my YouTube channel is me kind of turning on a camera, seeing something on the internet or hearing something from a person and talking about it, and then reading the comments section to hear what other people are talking about it, and then having other people come into the live streams that we're running on the flotilla of channels that we have going in our little corner of the internet, and them talking about it and us hearing each other talk about it. So I sometimes look at what we've collected in what we call the little corner of the internet, which is sort of this group of channels that have kind of gathered around my channel and other channels, is that we've sort of become an alternative to AI. Because whereas a large language model is doing all this statistical analysis of language, what we've actually done is collected a group of people that are sort of wrestling with the ideas of today and listening to each other and talking to each other. And that's actually way more fun than just listening to celebrity YouTubers talk about things, because celebrity YouTubers have to sort of stick to certain celebrity YouTubers suffer from audience capture because they've grown a big following and started making money by talking about certain things and maintaining certain orthodoxies. I don't mean Christian orthodoxy, but just sort of thought orthodoxies. And so those hierarchies actually bind and blind. So you're actually better off sort of feeding from different YouTubers, large and small, and learning from them and creating a learning community.
Interesting. And since we've talked about, a lot of prominent thinkers that are Christians, who do you think are the most influential Christians of the 21st century?
Well, influential, that's broad. Influencing me. So, C.S. Lewis, I think, was a big influence on a lot of us. C.S. Lewis, I've got books on my shelf that my grandfather bought, C.S. Lewis's books. I saw my father read a lot of Lewis, and Lewis has been very helpful to me. Tim Keller, I think, was a really helpful. Um, Tim Keller was helpful in a number of ways. Tim Keller was helpful in terms of modeling pastoring in public. And so I owe a lot to him. It's going to be interesting to see the Jordan Peterson sort of broke some things open and other people have walked through the door. I don't know how to answer that question in a lot of ways because I think Lewis, what's interesting about Lewis is he was metagelical before we could recognize it. Because Lewis was a medieval scholar and a medievalist and also a classicist, he read all of those church fathers, usually in their native language. And as a medievalist, he read, I mean, people, some of so Lewis was essentially a tutor. So if you were studying You would, you would go to Lewis and you would sit down with him every week and you would have basically one-on-one. And he was tremendously challenging. He was tremendously impressive, but he could also be playful. And I heard a story once where um, someone would someone would give Lewis a quote, could be in Latin or Greek or something like that, and Lewis would sort of sit back and think about it, and then he would tell them exactly where the quote was from. I mean, he had that kind of mind, and so he digested so much material from antiquity and the medieval period, and he knew it so well. And what's interesting about Lewis is that his straightforward apologetics work happened in the middle of his career. And to the surprise of many, he sort of abandoned it and then began writing, the Narnia Chronicles children's book. And many people looked at Lewis and said, "What are you doing? You don't even know any children." I mean, he was a confirmed bachelor. He didn't seem to even have much interest in children. And he wrote children's books, which are they children's books? Yeah, they are. But they're also sort of weird code for a lot of the thought that Lewis was having with respect to the modern world, the medieval world, and the ancient world. And there's a few little books that he sort of put some of these things together. And for the last 60, 70 years, Lewis scholars have sort of been trying to piece this together. Like recently, there's a book out on Planet Narnia where they think they've cracked some of the code behind the Narnia Chronicles. And Lewis loved that kind of thing. And so, and of course, Lewis was tremendously instrumental in Tolkien following through and publishing what was arguably the most influential book of the 20th century, the Lord of the Rings. So I think, even though it's really hard to judge living people, because if you had looked at C.S. Lewis in the late 50s, most people agreed at that point his career had already sort of receded. How many people thought Augustine would be who he would become within 50 years of his lifetime? I mean, Augustine now is this mammothly influential figure. So I think it's really hard to try to judge anybody's influence, even really within 100 years. So I'll pick Lewis because I think that's the best I got.
No, that's fair. That's perfectly fair. Okay, last question for you. If God asked you if God came down and said you can ask him one question and he'll answer it right then and there, what would you ask him?
For the problem with questions like this is I always pick at the question. Um, I'm not going to answer that publicly. I know the question I would ask him, but it's, one of the things you learn as a pastor is filter. Because the question, and this gets back to my point about reason first versus heart first. The question isn't a theoretical question. Theoretical questions are fine, they're fun, but they're not the questions I most deeply care about. The questions I most deeply care about are questions about people, because I care more about people than I care about theory. And maybe that's the difference between a philosopher and a pastor. But I, and they would be questions the kind of question that that would surprise no one. Why did this person do this or go in this direction instead of that direction? Because, or why did this thing happen to this person, which seemed so painful and difficult and caused so much calamity? But I think in many ways, I don't, if I pick apart the question, God doesn't have to come down, he's here. Um, God doesn't have to um, start talking because he never stops talking. And I think the answer to my question is is seen in is seen in Christ on the cross. Because at the heart of so many of these questions is the real doubt, the doubt that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Because Adam and Eve look at that tree and the serpent says, this answer you were given about this tree, I don't find it convincing. He's holding out on you. You can't really trust him. And that's the answer that's given at the cross. Because the answer to our deepest question, I think, of every human heart is, can we trust God? Because the questions I have about painful things happening or people taking different turns or deeply held dreams and desires in my heart that are unfulfilled. I mean, those are the questions that, and then my question for God is, can I trust you? Can I trust you? And that answer was given at the cross. So I know it sounds like a preacher answer. I get it, but I think I don't I don't finally have a theoretical question for God. I finally have I have questions about the world and about things I see in the world, and I say, Lord, would it have been so hard if only this had happened or these things had not happened? And the answer I get from the cross is, you have to trust me, because I know that Christ's disciples, Tolkien calls it a eucatastrophe. Because Jesus, you see it in the Gospels when they're going down to Jerusalem and Jesus says, and this is the thing. People are like, well, I wish I knew the future. Well, okay. Jesus says, okay, this is what's going to happen. We're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be turned over into the hands of Gentiles. I'm going to be killed. And right when he said that, all of their ears shut off. Because then he says, and then I'll rise from the dead. And Sunday, Easter morning, they're not there with a cake saying, Happy Easter, Jesus, welcome back. No, it's the women who are going there assuming he's still dead. And so, the question that is at the base of all of our lives that must be answered by our lives is, do we trust him? Do we trust him with the world? Do we trust him with ourselves? And one of the things that the older you get, the more you care not so much about your own existence or your own creature comforts, or you see a lot of those things and it's like, those things come and go. The things you care about are your loved ones. And that's, most fathers would far rather experience pain themselves than watch their children in pain, or experience, most good parents will, what won't good parents give in exchange for their children's blessedness? And so these are the kinds of questions. And so to me, that is the question. That is always the question. Everybody has their own particular answer to it. That's always the question.
Wow. Despite there not being a question to the question, that was a very well and beautiful articulated answer. So I really appreciate that, Paul. That is all the time we had. But Paul,
All
thanks for
right.
coming on. Any last words? You just shared a lot of wisdom in that concluding monologue, but any further tips, advice, words of wisdom for our audience?
Well, everybody debates the definition of what is a Christian. Then they go all different ways with it. Now that's fine. There's lots of things to explore, but my answer to that is based on the answer I just gave you. Is a Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. And I think that sits at the heart of the Christian life. And so, I just, if people want to hear some advice from me, my advice is learn to trust Jesus.
Amen. Paul, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Devin. Appreciate it.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.